Well, Andrew, thank you so much for making time
Pleasure.
and sharing your insights into the future of leadership. Now, before we go into leadership, can you share with us where did you grow up?
Sure. So mine's a very interesting international story in the sense that I was born in Ghana, West Africa, and I spent the first 8 years of my life in many countries in Africa, mostly West Africa. My parents were in the United Nations, so we traveled. So I spent time in Nigeria, Liberia, the Gambia, and many other countries around West Africa. And then at the age of 8, we moved to the UK, where I then spent the best part of 23 years living in the UK. And then since professionally working, I went to university in the UK, and I've since supplemented that with further education in France and the US. But professionally, I've lived and worked in every continent. And now, so that means Asia, that means Middle East, Europe, North America. I was in New York, Boston for almost a decade. Yeah. And now have been in South Africa for just under a year. So it's very much a global perspective I bring, and that's with education and growing up, and I think that's quite unique. I think you're right to say that, but it also gives me a different perspective, a global perspective.
So may I ask which continent is closest to your heart?
You know, the continent I was born is Africa. That will always have a special place in my heart. But I've traveled all continents, and I think they each offer something unique.
And as you grew up, Andrew, what was your dream career?
You know, interestingly enough, I actually wanted to be a doctor, a medical doctor, because my father, he's a medical doctor. And his ambition was that one of his sons would become a medical doctor, and there's 4 of us. And none of us actually made it. The closest one is my twin brother, who's a dentist. Yeah. So I actually wanted to be a doctor until at the age of 16 I went into hospital and I saw blood for the first time in a trauma situation, and then I fainted. Then the next day I went back and the same thing happened. So I realized that probably I wasn't cut out for that profession. Then I realized that I really had this interest in economics. Really understanding how the dynamics of supply and demand, and that just graduated into an interest in business. So that really shaped me in terms of where do I think about next once I realized that perhaps being a doctor wasn't conducive to my lack of ability to see blood.
And what were your sources of inspiration as you grew up, and sources of inspiration that informed your thinking and maybe informed your career?
Well, I don't think there's a single person or situation that did so, but I would say that over the years I've always taken a cue from people I admire. So certainly my parents, certainly leaders who've pioneered. So great examples in South Africa, Mr. Mandela, a great inspiration to many people. If I think of in Europe, there are many great, same as the US. So not one person particular has inspired me, but I think there's been a range of people I've tried to take a little bit from each person.
And when you look back at your career, would you say there was a turning point, or maybe 2?
When you're living through change, you don't realize how much you're actually absorbing and learning, and how much that's shaping your career. So I would say the turning point of my career and trajectory was the time I spent at Old Mutual.
In the Bermudas.
That's exactly right. So that was a business that had gone through some challenges, had lost a lot of money, and then I was parachuted in from head office in London to really fix and turn around that business. So over the course of a year or 2, we stabilized that business for a better outcome. But you don't actually realize how defining that is, because I call those situations big, scary, hairy days, because you would come into the office not knowing what to expect. And this was a business that had lost well over $500 million, had to be recapitalized, almost caused material issues for the parent company. And there's a lot of responsibility. And I was a young man at the time. I think I was 33, 34 at the time. And I was put in charge of a business that almost sunk Old Mutual, the group, to fix it. So and that was my first real test of leadership in a crisis. And so I think, professionally, that was a real defining moment. And since that, I've since gone on to do a number of other transformation, business regrowth, business, growth stories, particularly in emerging markets. But I look back to that as quite a unique time. But as I said, living it through the days, day by day, then I didn't realize what it meant until, the business was fixed.
Is it fair to say that you are a transformational strategist and that you have the ability to turn around the business, possibly through innovation?
What I would say is what interests me are situations where there's a challenge. And the challenge could be either fixing a business, transforming a business, growing a business. And part of that transformation journey does involve, being agile in how you think about the customer. Agile in terms of new products and solutions, which speaks to the concept of innovation. So I would say I'm not one for the status quo. I'm not one for leading a business where if the objective is to grow 2% every year, that's not me. So I generally gravitate to big challenges.
And what would you say is driving you today?
What's driving me today in terms of, let's talk Alexander Forbes first, then we'll talk
Sure.
maybe more personally. I believe we're a great brand name, a great business, but frankly, a business that's lost its way. A business with huge upside potential, and we're on a journey to create an African financial services leader, bringing global insights into how we lead and shape the retirements, the investments space across Africa. So I think that's a great area of interest to me. I think on a personal nature, I have 2 young children. And I think what inspires me is just trying to be a good role model to them, teaching them the values of trust, integrity, being honest, because we do live in what I would call a VUCA world. It's very volatile, it's uncertain, there's ambiguity and it's complex. So, how do you set the right goals and behaviors and characteristics, to enable them to be grounded? That's a big focus.
So Andrew, when it comes to the future of leadership, what does that term mean to you? What do you see does the future of leadership hold?
The future of leadership to me is about being bold. The future of leadership is about making tomorrow, in some respects, today. So where is the world going? There's the onset of technology, there's the onset of digital, there's the onset of mobile. The workforce is generally getting, more digitally savvy. We're bombarded with lots of information. So how do we decipher that? So I think the future of leadership has to be able to connect more dots faster, with a much more consumer-centric mindset on. So it's hard to believe that the iPhone celebrated its 10th year, I think, this year. How did we survive 10 years ago? In 5 years' time, I suspect the pace of technology in the next 5 years will probably exceed the pace of technology in the last 50 years. I mean, it's that way inclined. So the role of leadership is to really translate the tomorrow into today.
And what have you learned from your own journey that you consider important for aspiring leaders?
Be authentic. Be yourself. So leadership to me is all about getting work done through others. There's a difference between being a manager and a leader. For me, a leader is about being inspirational, making colleagues achieve certain feats they never thought was possible. And to do that, they've got to buy into you. And to buy into you, they've got to buy into your authenticity. And if you're not an authentic leader, I don't believe you're a strong leader.
Now, Andrew, when you speak to youngsters, when you speak to aspiring leaders, what do you tell them they should focus on to future-proof their career?
I've spent a lot of time doing that, particularly in Alexander Forbes, as we seek to develop our future leaders. And in fact, we've just created a future leaders program where we've taken some of our bright young stars in the business and have put them on a 3-year management development program. What I say to them is, don't be afraid to take risks. What's the worst thing that can happen? You fail. But you learn a lot more from the failure than you do the success. So the other thing I always say is I always encourage, individuals or colleagues to take different jobs. I always say you've got to be in the zone of being slightly uncomfortable, because when you're in the zone of being slightly uncomfortable, that's when you achieve your greatest learnings. I'm not suggesting be completely out of your depth, because I think that's reckless. but it's the zone of being slightly uncomfortable. So I would say, don't be afraid to take risks, push yourself, try different roles as you develop your career. Don't assume that you should be in the finance stream forever or the operations or technology. Try different things as you expand your repertoire of skills, because the leader of the future, will have to have a very balanced approach to leadership and management, which is largely about people.
So would you say the leader of the future should almost be an explorer?
For me, I'd say the leader of the future should have a global perspective, because I don't think we live in a monolithic world. I think the world we live in is complex. I think it's becoming much more global. Being able to relate to people of different cultures, different creeds and backgrounds. So I do believe that the leader of the future has to be able to assimilate lots of different cultures to understand people, because leadership is about motivating people, inspirational leadership, that is. So I do believe the leader of the future has to have a much more global perspective.
Now, when it comes to technology, Andrew, which are, in your view, the key technologies that will be driving the leadership of the future?
There's a lot of commentary around digital. And I do believe that digital has fundamentally changed many aspects of our business. So, we can use the widely quoted examples of Airbnb or Uber being disruptors, but they've disrupted largely through technology. So I think the financial services industry has been somewhat slower in terms of using technology and digital to provide better solutions, but I think it's a focus of the industry, particularly in insurance. How do we use data we collate about an individual to have individual specific pricing for that individual? So I do think that for us at Alexander Forbes, technology is a fundamental part of our future strategy as we try and transition the business to become much more of a digital insurer, because that's our ambition.
Now, when you speak to future leaders, which social media platforms do you recommend they should use?
I don't think I would categorize one above another. I mean, it's really down to your personal style and preference. But certainly, forums such as LinkedIn, Twitter, and the like are very useful forums that many leaders use. But I think it's down to your own individual preference. I mean, but to me, nothing beats good old face-to-face contact, face-to-face networking, where you can engage with your peer group to share ideas, and that human contact should not be lost.
Now, can you maybe share with us one or two success stories where you mentored a future leader and they have risen to great success?
Well, I think over the course of my career, I've been very fortunate to work with many talented people and mentor many talented people. So, one example, is earlier in my career, I worked with a colleague. We were peers at the time. And I just gave a different perspective of pushing yourself, seeing things from different perspectives. Don't stay in the finance work stream forever. And this individual's now in a very senior position in industry. So I think it boils down to the ethics of hard work, pushing yourself, being in that zone of being slightly uncomfortable. So I think there have been lots of examples, but that one stands out for me because it was an individual that, let's just say, wasn't focused or driven back in the early 90s.
And so you changed his mindset.
Absolutely.
Now, in the world of business, Andrew, which are the role models that you suggest future leaders should study, maybe learn from?
My view on that is that I don't think any one particular person should be the role model. I think it must be a blend of different people who can offer different insights and perspectives. So, for instance, they're great motivational leaders, great visionaries, people like Steve Jobs that could see the world 10 years ahead. But again, they're great pragmatists like Henry Ford, whose ambition was very simple. He wanted everyone to have a car so long as it was black. I mean, his view was every car had to be black because mass production. So I do think there are elements you can learn for many different leaders and actually make sure that they're aligned with your values. Because, a key part of authenticity to me is being true to your values and your creed. Don't try and change who you are because you want to mold yourself into somebody else. Be yourself. But certainly take some perspective from others.
Now, Andrew, where can listeners follow you? How can they connect with you?
They can connect with me through LinkedIn. I use that a lot, but I'm also very open to them engaging with me through other forums. I belong to a number of business forums in South Africa and in the US, but I'm very open to listeners to connect with me however they see fit.
And last but not least, what is the one piece of advice you would give to future leaders that they should implement in their lives and in their career?
Have a plan. Have a plan. Don't leave it to chance. Those who have a plan generally tend to meet the plan. If you don't have a plan, and hope and pray is not a strategy, so you need to have a plan, and you need to follow that plan.
Well, Andrew, thank you so much.
Real pleasure.
You are an inspiration. Your career is an inspiration. And I think there are many, many lessons to be learned from. So thank you so much.
Real pleasure.